I ask unanimous consent for 2 minutes of debate, equally divided.
Without objection.
Madam President, we are facing an absolute crisis with our schools. Today, only 40% of school kids in America are attending in-person school 5 days a week. It has been a year since these COVID lockdowns began. Millions of school kids are falling behind, and it's falling disproportionately on low-income kids, on African American kids, on Hispanic kids. This bill spends billions of dollars on schools and doesn't require that they open. My amendment does something very simple. It says if a school is open, it gets the new money that is in this bill. But if the school is not open 5 days a week, then that money goes to the parents, up to $10,000 per child, so they can get their kids an education. We have single moms with kids trapped in schools that are not open, and this crisis, this body can do something about. Those kids, if they fall behind, the science and the data tells us they will be behind potentially for the rest of their lives. We should come together in a bipartisan way to say we're going to open the schools and we're going to give hope and relief to the kids who are being left behind.
Madam President.
Senator from Washington.
Madam President, this is yet another amendment that conditions funding for our public schools under the guise of wanting in-person learning, when in reality, withholding this funding is counter to everyone's goal. But this amendment goes a step further. It strips much-needed funds from our public schools that want to reopen for in-person learning and implement safety protocols that are aligned with local public health guidance in order to create a voucher program. That's right. This amendment takes money from public schools that serve 90% of our students and sends those funds to private schools. It's unclear to me if our colleagues' goals are really about reopening public schools or just about advancing long-term ideological goals. If we only provide funding to schools that are physically open, schools and communities with high transmission rates of COVID-19 will not receive the resources necessary to implement safety health protocols. Conditioning funds undermines our ability to actually get our students back into the classroom. Let's stop wasting time and pass the American Rescue Plan so those resources can get to our schools and our students.
I ask for the yeas and nays.
He says sufficient second. There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Lankford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed. Oh, I already did it. Oh, wow. Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse. Oh, there you are. Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Barrasso, Blackburn, Bozeman, Braun, Burr, Capito, Cassidy, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Cruz, Daines, Ernst, Fisher, Graham, Grassley, Hoeven, Hyde-Smith, Inhofe, Johnson, Langford, Lummis, Risch, Romney, Rounds, Sass, Scott of Florida, Shelby, Thune, Tillis, Toomey, Tuberville, and Wicker. Mr. King. I got you. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Coons, Duckworth, Durbin, Feinstein, Gillibrand, Hassan, Heinrich, Hirono, Kane, Kelly, King, Klobuchar, Lujan, Manchin, Markey, Menendez, Merkley, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Peters, Reed, Rosen, Sanders, Schumer, Shaheen, Smith, Tester, Warner, Warnock, Warren, and Whitehouse. Mr. Leahy. No. Mr. Marshall. Aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. Bennett, no.